morning, St. John's. Today we continue with our series on praying the Psalms, and this week we are looking at Psalms 88. If you'd please turn with me to Psalms 88. And if you're there, I'll go ahead and read. No, just sit. It's okay. If you're there, let's go ahead and I'll read. A psalm of Heman the Ezrahite. O Lord, the God who saves me, day and night I cry out before you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of trouble, and my life draws near the grave. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like a man who without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily upon me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have taken from me my closest friends, and you have made me repulsive to them. I am confined, and I cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call to you, O Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do those who are dead rise up and praise you? Is your love declared in the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the place of darkness, or the righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? But I cry to you for help, O Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, O Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I have been afflicted and close to death. I've suffered your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken my companions and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So today we are looking at Psalms 88. If you've been here the past 2 weeks, during the first week we talked about finding joy and we explored Psalms 40. Last week we looked at Psalms 27 and we talked about mending our hope. Today our psalm takes us into a deep pit, and here we'll encounter Heman the Ezrahite, who is actually going through a very difficult time. Now, most people have heard about the Door of Hope International. This is a ministry which was founded to be a voice and a helping hand. What most people do not know is that the ministry was founded by Haralan Popov, and its purpose was to support Christians who were facing persecution for their faith in Jesus Christ. Haralan Popov is originally from Bulgaria, and in 1948 he was arrested and accused of spying for the United States. He spent 15 years on charges of treason, espionage, and supplying information to foreign governments. After he pleaded guilty while on confinement, Haralan and others were sentenced, and he was released in 1962. He started a worldwide campaign for human rights and religious freedom. On the night that Haralan was arrested, the soldiers came to his house. They searched his home for hours and hours, which felt like it was torture for him and his family. And in the book, Tortured for His Faith, Harlan says this, that the soldiers told him to come along, that it was just for a little questioning, which he later realized would go on for 13 years during imprisonment. In our psalm today, we encounter Haman. Haman is going through a very, very difficult time. And we get a vivid description of his prayer as well as attitude towards God during this season. Now, Haman was one of the sons of Korah. They are known as the composers of some of the Psalms, and the Psalms are known as the Songs of Korah. Not much is, we are not told much about Haman, except some Bible versions suggest that yes, he was a musician. He also served as a king's seer, and he had a very large family, 14 sons and 14 daughters. And so in our psalm today, Haman begins by calling out on God's name. He says Yahweh is his Lord, and then follows that by also saying God. Now, you may wonder why he repeats God's name twice. It is for emphasis. He wants to kind of get God's attention, and he tells us that he's calling on Lord, his God. He moves on to tell us that God was the source of his salvation, and the fact that he knew that he could go to God by day and also by night. Here we see Haman alluding to God's constant availability despite his difficult circumstances. And he knew that no matter what was going on, he could go to God and pray to God. But the advantage for Haman was also that he, like David that we have spoken about, he had a personal relationship with God. And so even though in this psalm he seems desperate and he's looking for God, he's actually doing it because he knows he can turn to God and plead for salvation or deliverance. Now Haman goes on to ask God to hear his prayer, to listen to his cry, and makes it known to God that his life is full of trouble and actually death seems near. I do wonder if in your own life you've ever been in a situation where you felt like death was near. What did you do? Or whom did you turn to? Over the years, I've heard so many people who are sick talking about their near-death experiences, times that they felt like they were dying or they had died, and they felt like they were out of their human bodies. Some people believe these near-death experiences are true, while others argue that actually they're just dreams or hallucinations. Scientists, including doctors, have tried to study these near-death experiences, and they try to see what happens to the brain when the individual or the person is unconscious. One of the people that I looked at was Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's a former professor at the University of Virginia, and he has studied near-death experiences after he encountered a patient in an ED who told him that when she was unconscious, she felt she had left her body and then was observing it from the outside. Now, these experiences are common. They are common, especially if you look at the research for people who have been resuscitated or those who have been in a very deep coma or any other very serious illness. And they'll always talk about, share that they felt detached from their dying body, and they would often look at their body from the outside. Now, we do not know the kind of death or the kind of experience Haman is telling us. He doesn't actually tell us whether it was a near-death experience, but he also doesn't tell us whether he actually was in a coma or whether he was dreaming. But we can be able to assume that based on his description in the psalm, that Haman was going through a very difficult time. And the kind of death that he's talking about was not an easy one. It was nothing like what Ernest Hemingway says when he was young. He says that I was seriously injured by an exploding shell during World War I. And this is what he writes in a letter that he sent home to his family. Dying is a very simple thing. I have looked at death, and I really know that if I should have died, it would be very easy. This is not what Haman is talking about. Ernest Hemingway may have thought that death may be something easy, but that is not what Haman is talking about. Haman here is talking about a difficult death, which could be related to his circumstances at that time. It was one that he thought his life was full of troubles. He left his strength. He felt his strength had left him, and he could no longer continue living, even though he recognizes that he was a strong man. In verse 5, we see Haman then goes on to talk about living amongst the dead, where he lies like a corpse in the grave. He feels forgotten and cut off from God who he worshipped, and God who he claims earlier on that God was his salvation. Haman then continues with the same thoughts of feeling like he was dead due to the despair that he was dealing with. Now, we can assume that he not only feels like he is dead, he also feels like he has the stench of death because of being amongst the dead. He feels like God has actually forgotten him, and God, even though they have this close relationship where he can call upon God, he feels like God no longer cares for him, and that is why he says that he's now existing in the land of the dead. Haralan Popov, the pastor that I mentioned from Bulgaria in my introduction, he wrote in his book, Tortured for his Faith, he wrote about the kind of diet they used to eat in prison, and he calls it a death diet. It was a meal that was served back in Bulgaria, and the death diet consisted of 2 slices of bread, 6 tablespoons of soup, which he describes as just flavored water, which is slimy and putrid. The death diet, he says, Haralan says, was scientifically and carefully designed to ensure that the prisoners sustained life and had a weak pulse. Haralan therefore concludes that the sole purpose of the death diet that they gave the prisoners was to break them. It was to make them talk or do whatever the guards or the ones who ran the prison wanted them to do. For Haman, his misery, we do not know what is causing that kind of misery. But it could be that he was also in some kind of prison, whether real or imaginary. And it was tied to him feeling like God had actually forgotten him and God never cared for him. Haman actually was like a man who is broken, who is approaching death. In verses 6 and 7, Haman then moves on to talk about being in the lowest pit. And in this pit, this is where his misery was so bad that all it was doing to him is leading him deeper and deeper into the deepest pit that he could go into. He goes on to talk about God's anger, which was pulling him down and engulfing him. Here we see Haman in verse 6 and 7. Earlier on, he was actually talking about God and trying to talk to God. But in verses 6 and 7, we see Haman now turning, and he starts to blame God for the things that were happening to him. He starts to tell God that everything that is happening to him is because God is not with him. God is not responding the ways that Haman expected. I wonder if there are times in your life where you have felt like God has deserted you. What did you do? Who did you turn to? Or who did you even blame? As you think back, did you feel like you were honest before God in terms of blaming him for whatever was going on with your life? Sometimes we do face difficult circumstances. Whatever it is, it could be you're grieving the loss of a loved one. It could be you've lost your job, you've lost your income. It could be your health. Whatever it is, how do you deal with those very difficult circumstances? A few months ago, I was responding to a request to visit with a family at one of our facilities, and this time it was the death of an unborn child. And during the visit, the family requested me to say a prayer. And at the time, the baby's body was being held by the uncle. While I was praying, the uncle stopped me, and he started to share his difficulty with praying at such a time, wondering how I could pray to a God who would allow such suffering. The death of a baby who was almost born, full term. The baby was 38 weeks. And for me, this was very surprising. It had never happened to me before. And so I felt sad, but at the same time, I was intrigued and could sense the deep grief that this uncle was having over the loss of his nephew. The family members, the staff all around him, including the mother of the baby, they started telling the uncle to keep quiet and allow me to finish praying. But I sensed the need to stop, to validate the uncle's deep grief and anger towards God, because his questions were actually a form of lament to God. Because sometimes we think that we should only pray when things are going well. What about when things are not going well? I do think that this uncle was actually trying to pray to God in his anger, to lament about the loss of his nephew. I could see that he was struggling to understand why God even allowed the baby to grow in the mother's womb for 38 weeks, and then the baby dies. We may not know what Haman was facing. We don't even know whether it could have been a loss of a loved one. But in the psalm, we see Haman's misery and despair. And we can see that from these verses, he was in a very, very low place, the kind of place that some people may call the dark night of the soul. Haman's deep pit was like a trap. There was no way for him to escape, and his only friends had deserted him. He was in a dark place, a place where the only thing that he could identify with was death, because everything else had been taken away from him. Now, this seems to be the opposite of Job's friends in the book of Job. As you know, if you have looked at the Bible and read the book of Job, it's a good manual for how to deal with suffering. And we know Job's friends, 3 friends, actually come and sit next to Job, and one after another they try to give him advice on what he's supposed to do. For Haman, he did not have his friends. God had also taken away his friends. Haman had felt deserted by God to an extent that all he could do was plead for God's help. And God was not responding. He felt like a dead man and questioned if when he dies or if God can even hear the praise or the joy or even the cries of those who are dead. Now, I do think in Haman's mind, death seems like the end of everything. It was a place that Haman probably thought, can actually God find me here in my deep pit? Can God find me in my darkness, the deep darkness that I am in? Now, it's interesting that here, Haman was so concerned about the finality of life by talking about death. As we know in the Old Testament, they did not know about Jesus Christ coming and what would happen in terms of resurrection. But here we see Haman choosing to wrestle with the aspect of what was going on around him by talking about death repeatedly, and death being the only answer that he could find. During the last 2 years of my studies, most of my time was actually spent doing research for my studies. And my research topic was actually inspired by an encounter that I had with a young man, not very young, I think he was in his late 40s. The man had some type of cancer, I don't know what it was, I don't recall. But I do remember walking into the ED once and the doctor telling me, oh, you need to visit so-and-so and say a prayer. And so I quickly dashed off. I said a prayer. There was no family. So I went back to the doctor to hear about the story of what was going on. And the doctor shared about his illness, but also told me that the young man had actually requested to meet with our palliative care team to explore end-of-life options. Now, I must say that as a Christian, I was intrigued, but also very disturbed at the thought of what the young man wanted to do. And I wondered how someone, even in their suffering, could choose that they just want to end their life because they did not want to suffer anymore. As I think back to that time, it had never occurred to me how much that young man was suffering. He was suffering to the extent that he could not stay awake without having a breathing tube down inside his throat and be able just to communicate by writing on a paper. As a Christian, I wonder what you do when you're suffering. When you, for example, you have an illness that is slowly destroying your body, what and how you'd respond during that season. Now, sometimes I think when we are suffering as Christians, the major response is to try and endure because that's what we are supposed to. But it's never that easy. It's never that easy in terms of saying, I'm a Christian, I'm going to hold on, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to do whatever needs to be done. I don't think it's as simple as that. And that is what Haman in our passage today is trying to show us. That even in his misery, he struggles, he wrestles. He wrestles with the God that he believes. He wonders why God has even deserted him and why God is not answering his prayer. But as Christians, we also know that there is another story to that. We know that even Jesus Christ came and suffered for us. Every April, we celebrate Easter. But we cannot celebrate Easter before we have gone through Good Friday. Good Friday is a time that we celebrate or we go through what Christ experienced as he journeyed towards the cross. And our resurrection, our being able to see that there is light at the end of the tunnel, which Haman couldn't see, is tied to the fact that Christ was not left in the grave. Christ arose again. As a Son of God, he understands what it is to be human and to suffer and to then endure and be able to come out on the other end as resurrected, the Son of God who is resurrected. When a human being is suffering emotionally, physically, or even spiritually, they may see death as the only option for them. And in our passage today, we see Haman suffering in a way that he's actually looking at death in the face. There was no other option for him. And for whatever reasons, Haman in the passage doesn't tell us what happened before or what happened after. We all know that he's in a very dark place. He's down with despair. But we also know that he feels like God has deserted him. And God was no longer present with him. And so death was the only answer that he thought about, because everything else didn't seem to be working. Haman was struggling with whatever it is based on his faith in God. He blames God for whatever is going on, but he also wrestles with God. You can picture this also in Jacob when he encounters, if you look at Genesis, when he encounters the angel and then has his name changed. That night, Jacob spends time wrestling with the angel, a person he did not know. And that could have been a physical wrestling, it could have been a spiritual wrestling, it could have been an emotional wrestling, and that's the same thing we see here with Haman. He's wrestling with God, and the advantage of Haman is that he has a relationship with God. Now, Brueggemann says that for Christians or people of faith, your wrestling takes place within the confinements of your faith. If you do not have faith, then you go outside your faith to seek answers in the world, to wrestle with them when you're having a difficult time. And so for us, Haman is trying to show us that in your darkness, in your deep pit, you can always go back to God. Death, as I mentioned earlier, is a sense of finality. It's a final place. But we know as Christians that is not the final thing. We know as Christians we will be reunited with God. Now, despite Haman's desperate situation and prayer for God's deliverance so that he can be able to continue praising and worshiping God, he knows that he can find answers even when they are not there, by worshiping the God that he believed in. When you pray and God doesn't answer your prayers, what do? Where do you turn to? Or do you even say that I'm not going to any longer have a relationship with God? In the final verses, Haman affirms his faith by crying out to God for help. We don't know if his circumstances change. As it is, when he closes the psalm, he says darkness is his best friend or closest friend. Again, he continues to ask God why God has rejected him and turned his face against him. And he ends by talking about whatever is leading to him thinking that he's facing death and feeling helpless and desperate before God. In a few minutes, we'll be celebrating communion together. And Psalms 88 is one of the Psalms I would say has been fulfilled by Jesus Christ, because it echoes the experience that Jesus had in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest with the disciples. As you remember, Jesus was in deep agony about what was to happen to him. He even prays that, God, please take away this cup from me, and then surrenders himself to God's will. Jesus stepped into a pit of darkness, just like Haman is talking about. And that night in the garden was the beginning of the journey of suffering for us as humanity. He bore the full weight of our sin on the cross. And everybody abandoned him just like they did to Haman, including his own disciples. Christ took on the curse of death on our behalf. And this is a comfort, because unlike Haman, who did not know about Jesus Christ, but he knew God, for us, no matter how dark things may be in our lives, Christ understands. Christ is present with us, and he's always with us during those very difficult circumstances. Amen. And now I would like to invite our communion servers to come forward. And as they do so, let's ponder God's word to us this morning in a moment of